The stone did not remember warmth. That was the first thing anyone learned about Ravenshade Keep. Not from the servants, who had forgotten how to speak freely, and not from the nobles, who came every winter with their ambitions packed alongside their luggage. You learned it from the walls themselves, from the way the candlelight flattened against the granite like something defeated, from the way sound traveled wrong through the corridors, arriving a half-second too late, as though the castle processed noise the way a predator processed threat. Slowly, thoroughly, with absolute intention. Duke Lucien Ravenshade had not always been the thing that made grown men find reasons to leave a room. There was a version of his history that the older servants remembered in fragments and never discussed aloud. A boy who had learned to play the piano in the underground chamber his mother had loved. A young lord who had laughed at something his father said during harvest season. A man who had once written letters that ran 4 pages long to a woman he intended to marry. None of that version survived what came after. What survived was this: a man who moved through his own castle like a controlled weapon, who made decisions the way other men drew breath, without visible effort, without visible cost, and whose reputation had outlasted 3 attempts on his life and 1 full rebellion. He was 34 years old, and he had not heard music in 6 years. What he did hear, on the morning Eveline Laurent arrived, was the sound of a cart wheel cracking on the frozen road that curved through the outer gate. He was at the window of his study on the Upper East Tower, reviewing the winter census documents that his steward Aldrich had left in neat stacks across the work table, and the sound pulled his attention sideways before he consciously decided to look. He told himself it was the reflex of a man trained to notice structural failures, including wheels, including gates, including the small mechanical breakdowns that preceded larger ones. He did not examine that explanation very closely. The cart had lost a spoke on the ice. A woman stood beside it in the gray morning light, speaking to the driver with what appeared, from this height, to be calm practicality rather than distress. She was not dressed as a noble. Her coat was good wool but worn at the cuffs, and she carried a single large case that she had evidently lifted off the cart herself, while the driver crouched to examine the wheel. She did not look up at the keep. Most people, arriving for the first time, looked up. It was an instinct. The towers imposed that response. This woman looked at the wheel, at the driver, at the road ahead, and then at the case in her hand as though calculating weight and distance. Aldrich knocked and entered without waiting, which he was permitted to do. "The musician is here," he said, "earlier than expected." "I see that. The wheel." "Send someone for the wheel." Lucien turned from the window. "Have her shown to the east guest chambers, not the south wing. The south wing is still being prepared for the court arrivals." Aldrich wrote this down. "She's brought only 1 case. The restoration supplies are arriving separately by the larger wagon tomorrow." "Then she is 1 day ahead of her materials." "Yes. Should I tell her she may have the day to settle herself before—" "Tell her nothing about her schedule," Lucien said. "She'll find her way to what she came here to do, or she won't. That's the only assessment that matters." Aldrich had been his steward for 11 years. He did not flinch at instructions like this anymore. He simply wrote them down, nodded once, and left. Lucien returned to the census documents. The numbers were clean this year, cleaner than the previous 2, which had been complicated by the drought in the Eastern Valley holdings and the subsequent need to redistribute grain from the northern stores. He had managed both crises without borrowing against the duchy's credit and without reducing the garrison wages, which would have created a different and more dangerous kind of problem. Managing Valemont was an exercise in sustained vigilance. Every decision had downstream consequences that required tracking, and tracking required a quality of attention that left no room for distraction. He worked through this morning without distraction. He did not think about the woman with the worn cuffs and the piano case. He thought about it once, briefly, when he heard footsteps in the east corridor that were unfamiliar. Not the measured tread of servants who had learned to move quietly, but something slightly different, slightly less careful, a person still mapping new geography underfoot. The sound passed. He returned to the census figures. The morning finished. It was during the afternoon staff review that he first spoke to her directly, and it was not planned. He had come down to the main hall to meet with his head of household, a woman named Petra, who had managed Ravenshade Keep's domestic operations for 14 years, and who communicated almost entirely and contained disapproval. Petra's reports were comprehensive and delivered at a pace that suggested she had never in her life spoken a superfluous word. Lucien respected this. They were standing in the entrance hall near the cold fireplace. It would be lit that evening for the arriving early court guests. When Evelyne Laurent came down the east staircase carrying what appeared to be a rolled document, walking with the same lack of ceremony she had displayed on the road, she stopped when she saw them. Not from uncertainty, Lucien noticed, but from the reasonable recognition that she was interrupting something and was calculating whether to retreat or proceed. "Miss Laurent," Petra said, not warmly. "I'm sorry to interrupt." She looked at Lucien with the directness that he would come to recognize as her primary mode of engagement, not challenging, exactly, but entirely without the performed deference that most people brought to this hall. "I wanted to ask about access to the lower levels. The steward said the restoration survey was my first responsibility, but the door at the east corridor's end is locked." "That door is kept locked," Lucien said. "Yes," she said. "That's why I'm asking about access." Petra made a small sound that was not quite anything. Lucien looked at Evelyne Laurent for a moment with the same quality of attention he gave to census documents and garrison reports. She was perhaps 26. Dark hair pulled back in a way that was practical rather than styled. Her eyes were steady, and she had not looked away from his face since she addressed him, which meant she either didn't know who he was, or she knew exactly who he was and had decided something about that already. "What is your assessment of the chamber's condition based on what you've been told?" he asked. She unrolled the document slightly. It was, he saw, a hand-drawn floor plan, rough, but accurate in its proportions, which meant she had sourced it before arriving, which meant she had done preparation work that most people in her position would have deferred until they were on site. Based on the description in the commission contract, the chamber has been sealed for approximately 6 years. The piano is almost certainly in poor condition. Humidity, temperature variance, likely some structural deformation of the soundboard. The frescoes on the upper walls may have fared better if the room maintained consistent temperature, but I won't know until I'm inside. The acoustic restoration is dependent on what I find. I can't give you a timeline without a survey. And if the piano is beyond restoration, then I'll tell you that. That's also part of the survey. Lucien looked at the floor plan in her hands. He had not seen a floor plan of that level of the keep in years. He did not ask her where she'd obtained it. "Petra," he said, "have one of the housekeeping staff give Miss Laurent the east lower key. She'll need it for the duration of the project." He looked back at Evelyne. "The lower chamber is not part of the castle's active circulation. You'll have uninterrupted access during daylight hours. After dark, the eastern wing below the ground level is not staffed." "I understand." "Do you?" Something shifted in her expression. Not defensiveness, something more like recognition. "You mean the isolation is a practical fact I should account for, not a warning?" "I mean," Lucien said, "that if something breaks down there and you're alone after dark, the response time is not what it would be in the upper keep. I'm telling you so you can plan accordingly, not so you can thank me." She looked at him for one more moment. "All right," she said. She turned and went back up the stairs. The rolled floor plan went with her. Petra said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, "She has a confident manner." "She came to do a job," Lucien said. "See to the key." The first nobles arrived that evening, 2 minor families from the eastern counties, arriving ahead of the main winter court wave as they did every year to secure the better guest rooms and establish their footing before the more powerful players descended. Lucien received them in the great hall with the formal correctness that he performed as fluently as a language he had learned young but no longer loved, listened to their reports of road conditions and regional disputes, offered the exact quantity of hospitality that the occasion required, and dismissed them before the second hour. They left satisfied. Satisfaction was the correct outcome. Satisfied guests caused fewer problems than anxious ones. Later that night, in the deep cold of the keep's second hour, Lucien was working in the study. He rarely slept more than 5 hours, had trained himself out of the need over years of necessity. When he heard it, or thought he heard it, a sound that came from below, from some direction that was not the servant corridors or the kitchens, low and intermittent, with the quality of something being tested rather than played. A few notes, then silence, then a different register, exploratory. He sat completely still for 11 seconds. Then he stood and took the east corridor toward the lower stair. The sound grew clearer as he descended, resolving itself from ambient impression into something real and specific. Someone at the piano, in the lower chamber, not playing a composition but running the keys and sequences that map the instrument's current range, searching for what remained and what was gone. The sound was halting and unglamorous. It was also, underneath the technical assessment embedded in every phrase, unmistakably musical, even in its brokenness, even in the half-functional notes that cut off where the mechanics had deteriorated. The intelligence guiding the touch was evident. The east lower door was ajar. He had not expected that. He pushed it open the rest of the way without thinking about whether he intended to. The chamber was lit by 2 oil lamps that she had placed on the floor on either side of the piano, which meant she was working on the instrument itself rather than surveying the larger room. She had the bass section of the instrument partially open, the side panel removed and leaned against the piano's flank, and she was playing with one hand while the other held a small lamp close to the interior mechanism, watching the hammer action with the focused attention of a diagnostician. She did not hear him enter, or she heard him and decided to finish what she was doing first, which was, he realized, more probable. After another half-minute, she set the lamp down on the floor, straightened, and turned around. "It's worse than I expected," she said, without alarm, without the performance of startled innocence that the situation would have produced in almost anyone else in this castle, as though continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. "The soundboard?" Lucien said. She looked at him with the briefest recalibration. He had answered with technical vocabulary, which was apparently not what she had prepared for. "The soundboard is cracked along the grain. 2 of the bass strings are broken entirely. 3 more are so corroded they won't hold tension. The hammer mechanisms in the upper register are seized for moisture. It can be restored, but it'll take longer than a standard tuning and regulation. It'll take actual rebuilding in places. You said you would tell me if it was beyond restoration." "It isn't beyond restoration. I said it was worse than I expected." She turned back to the instrument, not dismissively, but with the efficiency of someone for whom conversation was a parallel process to work, not a replacement for it. "The frame is intact, the cast iron is solid. That's the structural core. If the frame had cracked, we'd be having a different conversation. Since it hasn't, what we have is a rebuilding project, not a replacement." Lucien walked further into the chamber. He had not been in this room in 6 years. He had made the decision not to come here, and he had kept it with the same discipline he kept every decision, which meant that being here now required him to notice and set aside the specific quality of the air. Not damp, slightly cold, the smell of old wood and brass, and something faint that was specifically this room and had no name. "How long?" he asked. "For the piano alone?" 4 to 6 weeks if the replacement strings can be sourced quickly. The acoustic restoration for the full chamber, the frescoes, the flooring, the paneling, that's a separate timeline. What do you need? She pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and read from it. "Replacement treble and bass strings, which I've already specified in the commission contract. Those should be in the supply wagon tomorrow. Piano regulation tools, which I've brought. Appropriate lubricants for the action mechanisms, and time without interruption, which I'll manage myself." "You came down here in the middle of the night." "The survey was supposed to start tomorrow," she said, "but I was awake and the key was in my pocket." She closed the notebook. "I'll need to know if there are hours when the lower chamber is needed for other purposes, so I can plan around them." "There are no other purposes," Lucien said. "This chamber has been closed since my mother died." The statement landed in the room without drama. He had not intended to say it. He observed this without particular reaction. Some information escaped the perimeter of intentional disclosure, and the efficient response was to recognize it and move on, not to regret it. Evelyne Laurent looked at him, not with the complicated sympathy that people usually performed when death was mentioned in his presence, the careful condolence face, the overmanaged pause. She looked at him with something more direct and less manufactured, something that sat closer to honest acknowledgement than performed feeling. "I'm sorry," she said, simply. And then she turned back to the piano. He stood in the chamber for another moment, looking at the frescoes on the upper walls, scenes from some pastoral landscape that his mother had commissioned before he was born, figures moving through painted summer fields that had faded over the decades to something tender and illegible, shapes more than images now. The oil lamps from the floor cast the room's lower half in warm light and left the frescoes in a shadow that was almost protective. "The frescoes are restorable," Evelyne said without turning around. She was making notes in her small book again. The pigment has faded, but the plaster substrate durosmoso appears intact. It's actually the better news of the survey so far. What's the worst news? The ceiling, she said. There's water infiltration in the northeast corner. Historic. It's not active anymore, but it's left structural weakness in the vault. That'll need a stonemason before I can do anything with the upper register of the fresco work. I'll have someone assess it. Tomorrow, if possible. I don't want to start the upper wall work and discover midway through that the vault isn't sound. Tomorrow, he agreed. He left the chamber shortly after. He climbed the east stair in the dark, which he had traversed hundreds of times without light, and returned to the study where the census documents were still spread across the work table. He sat down. He picked up his pen. He did not immediately use it. The piano's sound, broken, searching, the technical mapping of what remained, had lodged somewhere behind his sternum with the clean precision of a compass needle finding north. He was aware of this the way he was aware of structural information, as data with operational significance. The significance was not yet clear. He filed it and returned to the census figures. He did not return to the lower chamber that night. The main wave of court arrivals came over the following 3 days, filling Ravenshade Keep with the specific noise of concentrated aristocratic ambition. Trunks on the main stair, voices calibrated for overhearing, the faint competitive percussion of first impression management. Lucien moved through it with the practiced navigation of a man who had hosted this ritual enough times to have mapped every current and hazard. He met with the Valemount Provincial Council representatives in the long gallery on the first morning. He reviewed the Winter Trade Commission reports with the Eastern Duchy liaison in the afternoon. He received Lady Seraphine Vale and her father, Lord Hargrove Vale, in the formal receiving room on the second day with the correct temperature of welcome, warm enough to indicate continued regard, calibrated enough to indicate nothing was settled. Lady Seraphine Vale was 28, beautiful in the architectural sense that suggested active intention behind every element of her appearance, and possessed of a political intelligence that Lucien had always respected even when it was deployed against his own interests. The marriage discussion had been ongoing, in the oblique language that these discussions required, for the better part of 2 years. She wanted the alliance, and she wanted it understood that she wanted it without wanting to appear to want it, which was a precise social maneuver that she executed with genuine skill. The court is smaller than last year, she said, when they were seated with tea and the elder Lord Vale had been directed to a separate conversation with Aldrich about hunting schedules. Lord Thornmere's faction hasn't arrived yet. They're expected by week's end. Cedric Thornmere, she said, in the tone that attached a particular weight to a name, has been active in the southern counties since summer. My father's contacts suggest he's been consolidating relationships. Thornmere consolidates relationships the way other men accumulate debt, Lucien said, broadly and without fully accounting for the interest. A small, precise smile. And yet the accumulation itself is not without effect. I'm aware of Thornmere's current positioning. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that acknowledged the information had been received and would not be pushed further. This was one of her better qualities. She knew when a door was closed, and she did not stand in front of it. I heard you've commissioned a restoration project for the lower levels. That's ambitious for a winter court season. Practical, Lucien said. The deterioration was ongoing. Of the opera chamber? He looked at her. My maid mentioned it to one of your household staff, she said, without particular apology. Information moved in winter court as reliably as cold air. She had never pretended otherwise, which he respected more than he would have respected pretense. The musician from the conservatory in Aldenmere, she arrived before the main party. She arrived ahead of schedule. Is she competent? She appears to be. Seraphine Vale set her teacup down with the gentle precision she gave every physical action. It'll be interesting, she said, to hear music in this castle again, for those of us who remember what it used to sound like. Lucien said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually were around the topic of his mother. Seraphine Vale had known his family before the worst of it. She did not use that knowledge as leverage, which was, in the mathematics of his current life, a significant quality. After she and her father left, he stood at the window of the receiving room for a moment, looking at the courtyard below where servants were managing the last of the arrivals. The sky was the particular white that preceded heavy snow. By morning, the outer road would be impassable for at least 2 days. He was still at the window when he heard, from somewhere distant and below, a single piano phrase. Clear, searching, a test of something repaired, 11 notes in sequence that dissolved before they became a melody. Something cracked in the wall of his chest, a fracture so fine it was nearly soundless. He stood completely still until it closed over again. It did not entirely close over. Across the next several days, as the winter court settled into its rhythms and the social machinery of Ravenshade Keep turned in its ancient grooves, Lucien became aware of a pattern that he did not intend and did not immediately diagnose. He was taking the east corridor with a frequency that exceeded any practical requirement. He was aware of the sound from below in a way that was specific and continuous, the way you are aware of a sound you're listening for without having decided to listen. 3 times in 4 days, he found himself at the top of the east lower stair for reasons that, examined under the same standard he applied to his own decision-making in every other domain, did not hold up to scrutiny. He did not descend. He had not been back in the chamber since the first night. He told himself this was the correct calibration. Give the work its space. Do not hover over a project you've commissioned as though you distrust the person doing it. This was accurate. It was also not the whole reason. The whole reason was harder to manage. The whole reason was that being in that room had done something to a locked interior architecture that he had built over years with the same deliberate craft he brought to everything else, and he was not yet certain whether the fracture was structural or surface level, and until he was certain, he did not intend to test it again. On the 4th evening, he encountered Evelyne Laurent in the upper library. He had not expected her there. She was not part of the court circuit. She was staff, technically, a commissioned artisan, and the library was a space that court guests used socially. She was seated at the far reading table with a stack of architectural texts that she had evidently pulled from the historical section, taking notes in her small book, and she looked up when he entered with the same unadorned directness she brought to every encounter. "I'm looking for the original construction records for the East Vault," she said, "to understand how the water infiltration happened before the stonemason assesses it tomorrow." Lucien crossed the library to the reference shelves. "These," he said, pulling 3 bound volumes without hesitation. He set them on the table beside her. "The original East Wing construction is in the 2nd volume. The subsequent repairs, there were 2 significant ones in my grandfather's time and in my father's, are in the 1st and 3rd. She looked at the volumes, then at him. "You knew exactly where those were." "I know where everything in this library is." "That's—" She stopped, recalibrated something. "That's useful, thank you." He should have left. He had work in the study. Lord Thornmere was arriving the day after tomorrow, and there were security assessments from the garrison captain that required review, and the Eastern Trade Report was sitting on his desk with 3 open questions that the provincial liaison had failed to answer adequately. He sat down across the table from her. She did not perform surprise. She returned to her notes, which were dense and structured, with small diagrams of the vault cross-section that demonstrated genuine technical comprehension of what she was looking at. He looked at the open volume she had already been reading, not the construction records, but one of the historical accounts of the keep's earliest period, the section on the original lord's building philosophy. "He built downward first," she said, without looking up. "The original lord. He excavated the lower chambers before he raised the towers. The histories say it was a strategic decision. He wanted subterranean stability before he built height. But looking at the chamber's design, I think it was also personal. He wanted a private space that was finished before the political space existed above it." Lucien looked at the page she was referencing. "That interpretation isn't in the text." "No," she said. "It's in the proportions. The lower chamber is sized for intimacy. Everything above it is sized for power. You design differently for the 2 things, and he knew the difference." The library fire made its sound in the grate. From somewhere above in the keep, distantly, came the noise of the court at dinner, the specific hum of people performing their best versions of themselves for strangers. "Your assessment of the restoration timeline," Lucien said. "Has it changed since the stonemason reviewed the vault issue?" He confirmed the infiltration is historic. The stabilization work is straightforward. 2 days, he said. "So I can start the upper fresco work by week's end." She made a small notation. "The piano is further along than I expected. The strings arrived and I've replaced the bass section. The upper register needs another day's work on the hammer mechanisms, but I think it'll be playable, really playable, by the end of the week." "Playable?" not perfect, but playable. She looked up then, with something in her expression that was close to the specific pleasure of craft almost accomplished. There's a particular sound that a piano makes when it's been well made and then neglected and then brought back. It's not the same as a new instrument. There's something in the wood's memory, the way it responds to being used again. She stopped. I'm not sure that makes technical sense. It makes sufficient sense. She held his gaze for a moment. That particular quality of her looking, which was not invasive but was also not managed, which simply looked. Then she returned to the construction records. He stayed for another 40 minutes. They spoke twice more, about vault engineering and about whether the fresco's original pigment source was local or imported, a question she had pursued with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, tracking the documentary record and the historical accounts with the patience of someone who understood that important information required excavation. When he finally stood to leave, she said, without looking up from the second construction volume, "Your mother commissioned the frescoes herself. I found the original contract in the estate archive. She specified the figures and the landscape both. The painter was from the city, Alden Mere, the same conservatory I trained at." He was at the library door. He stopped. "I thought you'd want to know that," she said, simply. No performance of delicacy around it, no careful management of a topic she had decided was sensitive. Just information, offered directly, because she had found it and judged it relevant. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the fire in the grate behind him, the sound of the court above. "Thank you," he said. He did not hear music that night from his study. The lower chamber was quiet. He found himself at the east stair once, in the deep middle of the night, and this time he descended 4 steps before he stopped himself. He stood in the dark of the stairwell with his hand on the stone wall and his eyes open in the specific quality of the silence below him. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room that had been recently occupied, recently worked in, recently given back something it had been missing. He stood there for longer than he would have permitted himself to stand anywhere, doing nothing, for any other reason. He climbed back up. Lord Cedric Thornmere arrived 2 days later, with 8 members of his faction, and the particular social energy of a man who had been planning something and had spent the journey here deciding he was ready. Lucien received him in the formal hall with the appropriate ceremony, observed the calibration of Thornmere's confidence with the attention of someone who had been reading men like this for 20 years, and made 3 specific notes in the margin of his mental record. That evening, at the first large formal dinner of the full winter court, Evelyne Laurent was seated at the lower table with the professional staff and minor guests, where the commission's etiquette required her to be. Lucien sat at the head of the main table between Lady Seraphine Vale and the provincial council chairman, performing the social function of host with the fluency of long practice. He was aware of her at the lower table with a precision that had nothing to do with host's awareness. Twice during the dinner, she was addressed by Thornmere's secretary, a sharp-faced man named Aldous Vane, who sat near her at the lower table, and both times she responded with the same undisturbed directness she brought to every conversation. The third time Vane addressed her, she set down her fork and said something brief and entirely clear, and Vane turned away. Seraphine Vale, beside Lucien, said quietly, "Your musician has a manner." "So I've been told." Thornmere's man has been asking around, about her background. A pause of the precisely correct length. "I thought you'd want to know." Lucien looked down the long table. Evelyne Laurent had picked up her fork again. She was listening to the woman beside her now, her attention complete and uncomplicated, as though the previous exchange had cost her nothing, and she intended it to continue to cost her nothing. Thornmere, across the table from Seraphine Vale, was watching Lucien watch her. When their eyes met, Thornmere smiled with the calibrated warmth of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with what he'd decided. Lucien held the look for exactly the length of time required to communicate that he had registered it, then returned his attention to the provincial council chairman's account of the Eastern Boundary Survey. He answered 3 questions about grain tariffs. He accepted a second glass of wine he did not intend to drink. He completed the dinner with the precision of a mechanism that had never misfired. Afterward, in the corridor outside the great hall, Aldrich appeared at his elbow. "A message came this afternoon," he said, low and careful. "From the Southern Intelligence Contact. It concerns Lord Thornmere's activities in the counties over the summer." He offered the folded paper. Lucien took it. It was written in the coded shorthand of his intelligence network, which he had maintained since the first year of his rule and which had kept him 3 moves ahead of every significant threat for 11 years. He read it twice, decoded the key passages in his head, and stood with the paper in his hand for a moment in the cold corridor. Then he looked up toward the east wing, where below the stone and dark, a piano that had been silent for 6 years was almost ready to be played. The rebellion that would nearly kill them both had been in motion for months. He had not known. The information in his hand suggested he still did not know all of it, but he knew enough now to understand the shape of it, and the shape was larger and closer than anything he had allowed inside his perimeter in years. Thornmere's smile, across the dinner table. Patient. Already in progress. He folded the paper. He put it in his coat. He walked toward the east corridor with a stride that, to anyone observing, communicated nothing at all. No acceleration, no alarm, the controlled movement of a man going where he intended to go. What was inside the stride was something different. What was inside the stride was the specific cold clarity of a man who had built an empire on the premise that he needed nothing he could lose, who had just realized, at the worst possible moment, with the worst possible timing, when enemies were already inside his walls, that the premise had silently become untrue. Below, in the underground chamber, a single piano phrase rang out and stopped. Rang out and stopped. Then, for the first time, it completed itself. 12 notes finding their sequence, the upper register restored, the instrument's voice returned from 6 years of silence. The sound rose through the stone as though the stone finally remembered something it had tried to forget. Lucien stopped walking. His hand found the wall. The music continued. He stood with his hand against the stone wall, and the music moved through it. Not metaphorically, but physically, the vibration conducting itself up through centuries of granite into his palm, his wrist, the locked architecture of his forearm. 12 notes. Then a phrase. Then a longer sequence, halting at first, the piano finding its voice the way a man finds his after long silence, roughly, with false starts, and then with a sudden certainty that made the earlier roughness seem deliberate. Lucien did not move for 30 seconds. The intelligence report was folded in his coat pocket, and what it contained was specific. Thornmere had spent the summer building a coalition not of allies, but of grievances. 3 minor lords whose land grants had been reduced under the duchy's consolidation. 2 merchant houses whose trade routes had been rerouted through the new Eastern tariff system. A garrison captain in the southern fort, whose promotion Lucien had blocked 2 years ago on grounds that remained accurate and non-negotiable. The constellation of discontents was not, individually, dangerous. Constellations were the point. Someone had been mapping the separate resentments and drawing lines between them, and the result was a shape that had been assembling itself inside his duchy for 8 months while his intelligence network had been watching the borders. The error was his. He knew it before he finished the second reading. He had been watching the perimeter for external threat, and the architecture of the threat had been built from the inside, from the human material he had already assessed and categorized and filed under managed risk. The assessment had been accurate when he made it. He had not refreshed it. That was the error. He moved away from the wall and continued toward the east corridor, not toward the stair, toward his study. The piano followed him up through the stone for another flight, and then the keep's mass absorbed it, and there was only the cold corridor and his own footfall. In the study, he sat at the desk and opened the intelligence report again, and worked through it with the systematic attention he gave everything that required systematic attention, which was everything. He wrote 3 responses. To the Southern contact requesting further specifics on the garrison captain's involvement, to his head of internal security requesting a full current assessment of the winter court arrival's known affiliations, and to Aldrich requesting a comprehensive review of every household staff member hired in the past 18 months. The last was the most uncomfortable. It implied a breach in the domestic interior of the keep itself, which was a different category of threat than political maneuvering in the South. It implied proximity. He sealed all 3 letters and left them for the morning courier. Then he sat in the quiet study with the fire burning low, and he did something he almost never permitted himself, which was to be uncertain without immediately resolving the uncertainty. Thornmere's smile. The report. Aldous Vane at the lower dinner table talking to Eveline Laurent with the focused attention of a man executing a task rather than making conversation. Asking about her background. He sat with that for a long moment. The fire made it sound. Somewhere in the upper keep, the last of the dinner party was dispersing to corridors and guest chambers, the sounds of it faint and collective and entirely outside his current concern. He was not a man who made calculations about what he could afford to want. He had not needed to be that man for a long time, because he had arranged his life with sufficient precision that the question rarely arose. What you controlled, you did not have to calculate. What you didn't need, you didn't lose. These were not philosophies he had chosen in the abstract. They were conclusions he had reached through specific events, tested against specific pain, and found to be structurally sound in a way that most beliefs were not. The fracture in the wall of his chest from 3 nights ago had not closed. He recognized this with the same clarity he brought to structural assessments. The fracture was there. It had been made by a piano sound coming up through stone and by a woman who looked at him without managing the look, and by an afternoon in a library that he had extended by 40 minutes for no operationally defensible reason. It was there, and it was not closing, and the intelligence report in his coat pocket meant that whatever was fractured in him was now a tactical liability in a situation where liabilities were measured in lives. He went to bed at the 2nd hour and slept for 4. In the morning, Thornmere moved first. Not overtly. Thornmere was not a man who moved overtly in the early stages of anything. What he did was social, which was its own kind of weapon. At the morning gathering in the great hall where the court assembled for informal breakfast and the day's first round of political navigation, Thornmere positioned himself near the window group where 3 of the provincial lords were discussing the Eastern tariff situation, and he said nothing about Eveline Laurent directly. He asked, in the carrying tone of a man who had practiced seeming casual, whether anyone had yet heard the musician working in the lower levels. Several people said no. Thornmere said that he had, briefly, from the East Corridor stair. He said it was remarkable that such a commission had been awarded to someone so young, and with, he understood, such an unorthodox background. He said he meant no criticism by the observation naturally. The Duke's patronage choices were entirely his own. He said the word patronage with the exact weight required to make it mean something adjacent to its dictionary definition. Lucien was at the opposite end of the room speaking with the provincial council chairman. He heard it. He did not immediately react, and he did not react to the fact that he did not react, which was the more important discipline. His jaw did not tighten. His eyes did not move across the room. He continued the conversation about the boundary survey with the specific quality of attention that communicated this was his only current priority, which was the most effective possible answer to Thornmere's gambit. What moved through him, underneath the performed calm, was something he had not felt in years toward another person, something with territory in it, something that said the word patronage out of Thornmere's mouth was a category error that would be corrected, not as performance, but as fact. He finished the boundary survey conversation, set down his coffee, and crossed the room. Thornmere saw him coming. The group near the window made the small, unconscious reconfiguration that groups always made when the room's gravitational center shifted. Thornmere's face performed pleasant welcome. "Your Grace," Thornmere said, "we were just discussing—" "I heard what you were discussing," Lucien said. The quiet of his voice was not the quiet of restraint. It was the quiet of someone who had no need to raise his volume because everyone in this room had already understood the necessary things. Miss Laurent holds a commission from the Aldenmere Conservatory of Music, where she completed advanced training in historical instrument restoration and acoustic architecture. Her credentials are a matter of institutional record. The commission was competitive. She was the superior candidate. He looked at Thornmere with the specific flatness of a man who had already considered every option in this conversation and selected the one that cost him least. "Was there a specific concern about the restoration work you wanted to raise, or was this a general inquiry?" It was not phrased as a question. Thornmere held the look for 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than most men managed. "No specific concern," he said. "I'm sure the work is in excellent hands." "It is." Lucien nodded once at the group, a gesture that closed the exchange without ceremony, and walked away. He was at the far end of the hall before Seraphine Vale appeared at his elbow, which meant she had been tracking both conversations simultaneously, which was entirely consistent with her capabilities. "That was direct," she said, without inflection. "It was accurate. Those are sometimes different things in this environment." A pause of the measured kind. He'll recalibrate after that. Whatever he was testing, he got his answer. He was always going to get that answer. She was quiet for a moment. Lucien. The use of his name without title was a precision instrument she deployed rarely and with full awareness of what it did. I want to tell you something as a person who has known you for 15 years rather than as Lady Vale, who is currently a guest of the Winter Court. He looked at her. Whatever is happening with the musician, she said, not unkindly, not with the edge of jealousy, which was the more interesting thing about Seraphine Vale, that her intelligence consistently outran her personal stake. Thornmere has already decided its leverage. That means it becomes leverage the moment you give him a surface to press against. She met his eyes with the directness of a woman who had no illusions about either of them. I'm not telling you what to do with that information. I'm telling you that I have it, and I'm giving it to you, because that's what I've always done. He said, I know. She nodded once and moved back into the room's current. He watched her go and felt the specific complicated regard he had always held for her. Respect that was genuine, trust that was functional, and the absolute clarity that what she was offering him had always been a transaction, however well executed. She knew that he knew. The knowing was part of the transaction's architecture, and neither of them had ever pretended otherwise. He went to find Evelyne Laurent. She was not in the lower chamber. She was in the east corridor outside the chamber door, speaking with the stonemason who had come to begin the vault stabilization work, and she had a different floor plan rolled out between them. A larger one, he saw as he approached, with new additions in her handwriting mapping the water infiltration patterns she had identified. She looked up when she heard him coming, and something in her expression registered the quality of his arrival. Not his physical approach, but something in the specific purposefulness of it. And she said to the stonemason, "Give me a moment." The stonemason retreated to the far end of the corridor with the practiced neutrality of a craftsman who understood that the person paying for the work sometimes needed private conversation. Lucien stopped in front of her. "Thornmere's man spoke to you at dinner." "Vane," she said. "Yes." "What did he ask?" She looked at him steadily, not performing composure. She was composed, which was a different thing. "He asked how I came to be commissioned for this project. He asked whether I had prior connection to the Duke's household. He asked about my father's work in Aldenmere." Her voice did not change on the last sentence, but something around her eyes did, a compression so brief it was almost nothing. "My father was a musician. He died 3 years ago. He was also briefly employed by the estate of a southern lord who was later investigated for mismanagement of his duchy finances. The investigation cleared him completely, but the association is on record, and Vane knew this. He mentioned it as a point of curiosity," she said. "The way people mention things they intend to use." Lucien looked at her face, the compressed thing around her eyes, which was not grief exactly, but was something that had been managed for long enough that it had become structural, and felt the territory feeling again, sharper this time, with more precision in it. Vane had sat across from her at a dinner table and opened a wound with the practiced casualness of a man following instructions, and she had responded by setting down her fork and ending the conversation, and she had not mentioned it to anyone until he asked her directly. "Why didn't you come to me last night?" he said. "Because it wasn't an emergency last night." She said it plainly, without the performance of independence that people sometimes used as a shield. She meant it as information. "If it becomes an operational problem for the commission, I'll tell you. A man asking questions at dinner isn't an operational problem yet. It may become one. Then I'll tell you when it does." She held his gaze with the level attention that was simply her face, that was not challenging him, that was simply the way she inhabited a conversation. "I can manage all this, Vane." He looked at her for a moment. Then, "The investigation that cleared your father? The documentation is complete?" "Yes. The Aldenmere Municipal Archive has the full record. I'll have a copy brought here." Something moved across her expression. Not gratitude, more than gratitude, or different from it, the specific look of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told they don't have to. It lasted a second. Then the composure resettled, and she looked at him with something that was open and undefended in a way he had not seen many people manage in his direction. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He turned and walked back up the corridor before either of them had to manage what came next. That afternoon he had 3 meetings, reviewed the internal security assessment Aldrich had compiled, identified 2 household staff members hired through a placement service that had secondary connections to a Thornmere-adjacent merchant house, and quietly had both transferred to duties outside the keep's sensitive areas. He did this without announcement or accusation. Structural adjustments, the kind that could not be unmade after the fact. At the 4th hour past noon, he heard the piano. Not testing, not assessing. Playing. It came up through the east stair like it had always known the way, and it was the Aldenmere style. He recognized it distantly, the compositional structure his mother had loved, the particular melodic logic of the conservatory tradition. But under the formal architecture of it was something else, something that was the player rather than the tradition. A quality of emotional directness in the phrasing that did not announce itself but was simply there, in the way certain people told the truth without deciding to, because they had no architecture of concealment to draw on. He was in his study. He had work on the desk. The security assessment was in front of him with 3 items that required action before morning. He sat for 6 minutes without moving. Then he stood, left the study, and went down the east stair. The chamber was fully lit when he pushed the door open. She had brought additional lamps, and the stonemason's work on the vault had opened a narrow upper vent that let in a thin bar of afternoon light from the courtyard level, and the combination made the room look different from the first night, larger somehow, and more itself. The frescoed figures on the upper walls, still unrestored, moved in the warm light with a suggestion of the summer field they had once depicted. She did not stop playing when he entered. She finished the phrase she was in the middle of, let the last note decay fully, and then turned on the bench to look at him. "It holds," she said. The piano. The work. She meant both. He walked to the instrument and stood beside it. The lid was up, and looking down into the mechanism, he could see the work she had done. The new strings in the bass register, bright against the older copper-wound ones she had preserved where they were still viable. The regulation she had done on the hammer mechanisms, the small technical interventions that had collectively returned this object from the condition of a ruin to the condition of a working thing. "Play it again," he said. She looked at him. That look, direct and without performance. And then she turned back to the keys and played. Not the Aldenmere composition from before. Something she was building in the moment, or something he understood she had been building across the days of working on the instrument. A piece that knew its own limitations and used them, that played in the registers that were strongest and let the damaged middle voice rest, that was made specifically for this piano in its current specific condition, for this room with its faded frescoes and its new bar of winter light. He stood beside the instrument, and something in his chest was not fracturing anymore. The fracture had already happened. What was happening now was different, an opening, which was worse than a fracture in certain technical senses, because a fracture could be managed, and an opening could not be closed the same way it could not be unbroken, and what came through it was not what he had permitted himself to feel, since he had buried the version of himself that felt such things in the cold stone of this keep 6 years ago. He did not touch her. He stood beside the piano with his hands still and his face controlled, and he listened, and the music was real, and the realness of it after 6 years of silence was the most dangerous thing in this castle. More dangerous than Thornmere's smile, more dangerous than the intelligence report in his coat pocket, more dangerous than the coalition of grievances assembling itself in the South. He had built an empire on needing nothing he could lose. He had just lost the premise. She reached the end of the piece, or the end of what she had for it so far, the place where the building stopped and the silence resumed, and let her hands rest on the keys without lifting them, and the room held the last resonance the way rooms held the last of anything that had genuinely occupied them. "Thornmere isn't just asking questions," Lucien said. His voice was level. The interior was not level. He had stopped performing level and was simply inhabiting the gap between what he looked like and what was actually occurring inside him, which was the management strategy he had relied on for 11 years, and which was right now working at reduced capacity. "The intelligence I received last night indicates a coordinated effort. He has allies inside the court, inside my household, and based on the pattern of movement, inside the duchy's southern garrison." She had turned to look at him. The piece had ended. The look was steady. "He's going to move against you," she said. Not a question. "He's going to try to move through you first," Lucien said. "Your father's record is the surface. Underneath the surface is the intent to demonstrate that my judgment is compromised, that I've brought an unsuitable person into the keep, that the commission itself is evidence of something that would damage the court's confidence in my governance. He looked at her with the precision of a man who had processed this while standing beside a piano listening to music, and who was done with the processing now. He will use whatever he can find, and if he cannot find what he needs, he will manufacture it. The silence in the chamber had a specific texture. "What do you want me to do?" she said. The question was not small. She was asking it without fear, without the impulse to disappear that most people felt when a situation this large made itself visible. She was asking it the way she had asked about access to the lower levels on the day she arrived. Directly. Because it was the information required, because she did not intend to be managed around. He looked at her on the piano bench, in the chamber his mother had loved, with the restored keys under her hands and the winter light coming in overhead, and the conspiracy assembling itself in the floors above them. And he made the calculation he had been avoiding since the night he first stood at the east stair and heard 11 notes and could not make himself climb back up. "Nothing," he said. "You do nothing differently. You finish the work." "And you?" "I finish what I've started." He meant the security response. He meant the counter-moves against Thornmere. He meant all the operational machinery of a man who had protected this duchy for 11 years by being 3 moves ahead of everyone who wanted to take it from him. He also meant something else, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them named it because naming it would require a conversation that could not be had before the keep above them had been made safe, and it was not yet safe, and Thornmere was already in the building. He left the chamber. He climbed the stair. At the top in the east corridor he stopped and stood with his back against the stone wall and his eyes open and the music still moving through him like a current that had found a channel it had been looking for without knowing it was looking. Thornmere had made his first move. Lucien had made his second. What neither of them had accounted for, what Lucien himself had not accounted for, had refused to account for, had buried in discipline and control and the long, efficient silence of a man who had decided he did not need what he needed, was that the real point of no return had not been crossed in any council chamber or any act of political maneuvering. It had been crossed in the moment he walked down the stair and stood beside the piano and said, "Play it again." He could not uncross it. He understood in the east corridor, with absolute clarity, that the most ruthless man in Valemount had just handed his enemy the one thing he had sworn, after the worst year of his life, to never hand anyone. And he was not, standing in the cold corridor with the music in his blood, sure that he would have done it differently. The days between that moment in the east corridor and the midwinter masquerade moved with the specific compressed quality of time under pressure. Not slow, not fast, but dense, each hour carrying more weight than its clock measurement suggested, the way stone carries more cold than air does. Lucien worked. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of attention he brought to the working, which had shifted from the clean mechanical precision of a man managing known variables to something with more edge in it, more biological urgency, the kind of focus that the body produces when it has assessed the distance between itself and real danger and found the distance insufficient. He spent 3 days reviewing the full dossier his internal security officer compiled on Thornmere's faction members, not summaries, the raw material, the correspondence logs and the travel records and the financial transaction patterns that told the actual story underneath the social narrative. He found 4 additional household staff with compromised loyalty indicators. He had them reassigned with the same quiet efficiency as the first 2. He sent 3 riders south with sealed instructions to his garrison commanders, reconfiguring the chain of verification on the southern fort captaincy without making the reconfiguration visible as a response to anything specific. He was building a counter-architecture inside the existing structure, and the work required the kind of cold patience that had always been his strongest quality. In the evenings, he heard the piano. He did not go down again after the second time. Not because the desire was not there, it was there with a persistence that he had stopped pretending wasn't, but because the counter-architecture required that he give Thornmere no further surface to press against before the masquerade, and he had already given more surface than was strategically sound. He held the line. The music came up through the stone each night, and he worked at his desk with it moving through the building around him like something that had always been there and had simply been interrupted. On the 6th day before the masquerade, Seraphine Vale came to find him. She came to the study, which was not a social location. No one was invited to the study, it was understood. And she came alone, without the social machinery of a court visit, and when Aldrich showed her in, she closed the door herself behind her, which told him the register of what was coming before she said a word. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather not." She stood in front of the desk with her hands still at her sides and her face carrying something he had not seen on it before, which was the specific look of a person who has made a decision they know is costly and has committed to it past the point of recalibration. "I have information I've been sitting with for 2 days. I should have brought it immediately. I didn't because I was deciding what it meant for me." A pause. "Clean. I'm telling you now because I've decided what it means for me, and what it means is that I tell you." He looked at her and said nothing. "Thornmere has a document," she said. "I don't know its origin, forged or otherwise. I haven't seen it. But I've spoken to Lord Hargrove Willesden, who is one of the 3 provincial lords Thornmere has been working, and Willesden told me in confidence, which I'm now breaking with full awareness, that Thornmere intends to produce this document at the masquerade, publicly, in the ballroom, in front of the full court. What does the document claim? That Evelyn Laurent's father was not merely associated with the Southern Lord under investigation, that he was an active participant in the misappropriation, that there is a secondary record suppressed at the time of the original investigation through the influence of a Ravenshade estate contact, which your mother commissioned the suppression of because the Laurent family were musicians attached to her household, and she wished to protect them." Seraphine Vale held his eyes through the entire statement without looking away. "If the document is convincing, and Thornmere would not produce it unless it was at minimum superficially convincing, the implication is that your mother was corrupt, that you've knowingly continued an association with a family of proven traitors, and that the current commission is either willful disregard of that fact or evidence of compromised judgment." Lucien sat completely still. "He won't just be attacking her," Seraphine said. "He'll be attacking your mother through her, and he'll be attacking your fitness to rule through your mother." The fire in the study grate was the only sound in the room for 10 seconds. "Why are you telling me this?" Lucien said. She looked at him with the complicated intelligence he had always respected and which Xiao, in this moment, carried something that was neither calculation nor performance. "Because I've known you for 15 years, and I know what Thornmere is doing, and I won't be the instrument of it by silence." She stopped. "And because whatever I thought the situation between us was, I understand now that it was never what I wanted it to be. And I'd rather tell you the truth as a person who respects you than hold information as a person who wanted leverage." The room was quiet. "Thank you," he said. He meant it without complication. She nodded once. She left. He sat at the desk for 4 minutes after the door closed, which was longer than he usually permitted himself to sit without moving toward action. The thing about what Seraphine had just told him was not the political calculation embedded in it. He was already calculating, had begun the instant she said document, was 3 moves into the counter-sequence before she finished speaking. The thing that occupied those 4 minutes was something underneath the calculation, something that had to do with what a man's mother could be turned into 7 years after her death by a man with sufficient motivation and a piece of paper in a ballroom full of people who wanted to believe their grievances had justification. He stood up. He went to find Aldrich. What followed was 48 hours of the most precise preparatory work of his tenure as Duke, which was a high bar. He sourced the original investigation documentation from the Aldenmere archive through his fastest courier, confirmed the secondary record Thornmere's document reference did not exist in any legitimate archive, and had a comprehensive statement of the original investigation's findings prepared by the Duchy's chief legal officer, ready, but not deployed, held in reserve for the moment it was needed. He identified the 3 most influential, undecided provincial lords and spent 2 separate evenings in conversation with each, not about Thornmere or the masquerade, but about their specific concerns regarding the Eastern tariff system, which was the actual substance of their grievance and which he addressed with the kind of direct negotiating specificity he rarely permitted himself in social settings. 2 of the 3 left those conversations significantly less available to Thornmere's constellation than they had been. He told Evelyn none of this. He had made the decision and examined it carefully and held it. She was finishing the piano restoration. The vault stabilization was complete. She had begun the fresco work on the upper wall of the chamber, the figures in the summer fields slowly becoming themselves again under her hands. She was doing the work she had come here to do, and the keep had not become actively dangerous yet. And until it did, what he was building in the spaces above her was his to build without requiring her participation. He had also, in the middle of this, come to a conclusion about Thornmere that went past counter-strategy. Thornmere was not going to stop. The coalition he had assembled was real, and it had momentum, and the document, forged or not, was not the whole of his arsenal. It was the opening of a public phase that had been preceded by months of groundwork. Even if the masquerade gambit failed, even if Lucien neutralized the document cleanly in the ballroom, Thornmere would recalibrate and try again with the next instrument. The only complete resolution was the kind that ended Thornmere's capacity to try again, and that resolution required evidence of the conspiracy's full scope. Names, documentation, a chain of connection that could be brought to the duchy's legal apparatus as something unambiguous. He needed Thornmere to believe he was winning until he had finished gathering everything required to make the loss permanent, which meant the masquerade had to unfold, which meant Thornmere had to make his move in the ballroom, which meant Lucien had to stand in that ballroom and let it happen long enough to let it be the rope Thornmere hanged himself with. He had done colder calculations than this. He had done them in actual war with actual casualties on actual ground. He was doing this one now in a winter castle over a restored piano, and a woman who had looked at him without managing the look, and the coldness of it sat differently in him than the war calculations had. He was at the east stair at midnight, 3 days before the masquerade, when he heard something he had not heard from the lower chamber before. Not the piano. Voices. His body processed the information before his mind did. 3 steps down the stair before he had consciously decided, hand against the wall, weight forward, moving with the silence that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with a decade of moving through corridors where the wrong sound announced you. The chamber door was not fully closed. Through the gap, lamplight and 2 voices, Evelyn's and Aldous Vane's. "Don't understand what you think you'll find here," she was saying. Her voice was level, but the level was the kind that takes active maintenance, not the natural calm she carried in ordinary circumstances. "I'm not looking for anything," Vane said. He was inside the chamber. Lucien could hear the position of his voice. He was near the far wall, near the fresco work, and the specific quality of his movement suggested he was not standing still. "I was passing through, and the door was open. No harm in a look." "The door was not open when I went to get the lamp oil." A pause. "You must have left it." "Get out of this room." Lucien pushed the door open and stepped through. Vane turned. He was standing near the piano, and he had in his right hand a small leather portfolio that Lucien recognized as the research binder Eveline used to document the fresco restoration. Photographs, pigment samples, historical source material. Vane's fingers tightened on it briefly before he set it down on the piano lid with the careful motion of a man depositing a thing he had never been holding. "Your Grace." The performance of surprise was good, not good enough. Lucien looked at the portfolio on the piano lid. He looked at Vane. He did not look at Eveline because looking at Eveline required a quantity of interior management that he did not currently have available. "What were you looking for?" Lucien said. "Nothing. What were you looking for?" The second iteration of the question was not louder than the first. It had no heat in it. What it had was the quality of a door closing on an enclosed space, and Vane heard the acoustics of it, and his performance recalibrated, not to honesty, but to a different kind of deflection, the kind that acknowledged the first line had failed. "Lord Thornmere asked me to assess the commission documentation," Vane said, "to ensure the terms were in order. As a courtesy, given the—" "Thornmere has no standing in the administrative affairs of this household," Lucien said. "He has no authority over commission documentation, assessment functions, or any internal operations of Ravenshade Keep. The fact that you are in this room with that portfolio in your hand is a violation of restricted access that I can choose to process through the Duchy's legal office or through a personal conversation with Lord Thornmere that occurs tonight." He stepped further into the room. Vane did not step back, which was either courage or the paralysis that resembles it. "I'm going to choose the conversation with Thornmere. You're going to leave this chamber, return the portfolio to where you found it, and go directly to your guest room, where you will remain until I have spoken with your employer." Vane looked at the portfolio. He set it back down. He had already set it down. It was already on the piano lid, but the gesture was a repetition, a performance of compliance. He walked to the door. He stopped in the doorway. "The Lady Seraphine Vale," he said without turning around. "She's been having a great many private conversations this week. I thought you might want to know, in the spirit of complete information." Lucien said nothing. Vane left. The chamber was quiet. The oil lamps on the floor were doing their work. The fresco figures in the summer field suspended mid-motion on the upper wall, half restored and half shadow. Evelyn was standing near the instrument, and she was looking at him with the full open directness of her looking, and she did not perform anger or relief. She simply looked at him with the specific quality of someone who had just watched something important and was deciding what it meant. "He wasn't here for the portfolio," she said. "No. He was here to plant something." She looked at the fresco work, the research materials laid out across the side table. "Or to confirm what was already here." She looked back at him. "What is Thornmere building?" He told her. He had decided not to, and then Vane had been in the chamber with her portfolio, and the calculation had shifted past the point where withholding was operationally sound. He told her about the document, the forged secondary record, the attack on her father's name and his mother's, the masquerade as the planned theater. He told her with the directness of someone reading an operational briefing, not because he was performing detachment, but because the directness was the only register in which he trusted himself to tell her things of this magnitude without the fracture in his chest widening past what he could contain. She listened without interrupting. Her face did not crumple or perform distress. It did what it did when she was processing large information, which was to go very still, the stillness of a person organizing rather than collapsing. When he finished, she was quiet for 5 seconds. "He's going to use my father," she said. Not as a question, as the fact she was deciding how to hold. Yes, her jaw set. It was a small movement. In a different person, it might have indicated the effort to prevent tears. In her, he had already learned, it indicated the effort to prevent the expression of rage, which was a different instrument entirely. "My father spent 6 years clearing his name from an association that was coincidental and administrative, and that cost him every professional relationship he had built in 30 years of work. He died with the clearance documentation in a box under his bed because he carried it everywhere he went for 3 years after the investigation, in case anyone asked, and no one ever asked because no one remembered him anymore." The jaw, the stillness. "And Thornmere is going to stand in your ballroom and make it untrue again. If we let him." She looked at him. "What does let him mean in this context?" "It means I need him to make the move," Lucien said. "The document, the accusation, the public theater, all of it. I need him to commit to it completely in front of the full court before I respond, because incomplete evidence of conspiracy is not legally actionable, and complete evidence is. The masquerade is the moment he crosses from planning into act, and crossing into act is the moment he finishes building the rope." He held her eyes. "I need you to be in that ballroom when it happens. I need you to stand in it and let him say it, and trust me to answer it." The chamber was very quiet. "You're asking me to stand there while he destroys my father's name in public," she said, "so that you can catch him doing it." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The oil lamps, the summer fields on the upper wall, the figures in their permanent suspended motion. "If you don't answer it cleanly," she said, "if the documentation isn't airtight, if the court doesn't accept it, he doesn't just damage your position. He finishes my father." "I know. And you're asking me to trust you." "Yes." Another long moment. He did not look away from it. He did not manufacture certainty for her, or soften the ask, or wrap it in the vocabulary of assurance that the situation probably called for. He asked her with the full weight of what he was asking, because anything less would have been a transaction with her, and what he was doing was not a transaction. She looked at him. She looked at the piano under Vane's absent hands, at the restored strings, at the instrument that had been broken and was now a working thing. "All right," she said. He left the chamber. He climbed the east stair. He went directly to the guest wing and knocked on Lord Cedric Thornmere's door, and when Thornmere's servant opened it, he said, "Tell your lord I'm here," and walked past the servant into the anteroom and stood in it with his hands at his sides. And when Thornmere emerged from the inner room in his dressing robe, with the performance of disturbed sleep already arranged on his face, Lucien looked at him with the cold precision of a man who had stopped performing anything at all. Vane was in the lower chamber. Lucien said. "Accessing restricted materials without authorization. That's the first and final time that happens in this keep. If there is a second incident involving any member of your party in any restricted area of this castle, I will end the winter court season immediately and remove your household from the premises. You understand me?" Thornmere looked at him with the same surface calm he had brought to the dinner table. But underneath the surface, Lucien could see the calculation running, assessing what Lucien knew, what Vane had found or hadn't found, what this confrontation was meant to accomplish. "Of course," Thornmere said. "I'll speak to Vane immediately. I'm sure it was a misunderstanding." "It wasn't," Lucien said. "We both know what it was. I'm telling you that I know it, and that the misunderstanding framing won't be necessary between us. We can continue to perform civility for the court's benefit without it requiring either of us to pretend we don't understand the current situation." A long silence. Something in Thornmere's face shifted, dropped, not far, but measurably. The performed warmth receded, and what was left was the actual man, and the actual man was sharper and colder and more dangerous than the performance. And he was also, Lucien recognized, fully committed to what he was going to do at the masquerade. The confrontation had not deterred him. It had confirmed his read that there was something in Ravenshade Keep worth fighting for, and that the Duke knew it, and that the Duke's knowing it was the weapon. "Good night, your grace," Thornmere said. Lucien walked back through the keep in the dark. He passed the east corridor. He did not stop. He went to the study and sat at the desk and looked at the wall in front of him where a map of the duchy was pinned, the roads and the holdings and the southern fort and the constellation of positions that Thornmere had assembled across 8 months. He had 3 days. He had the legal documentation. He had the counter-strategy. He had Eveline's agreement to stand in the ballroom and hold while the accusation was made, which had required her to trust him with the one thing she could not afford to lose a second time. What he had not accounted for, what none of his preparation had addressed, because it had not been possible to prepare for it, was the information he received at the second hour when Aldrich knocked and entered with the face he used only for the category of news that required that particular face. The letter was from his Southern intelligence contact, a follow-up to the original report sent by Fast Rider, arriving 12 hours ahead of its expected time because the contact had assessed it as urgent. The garrison captain in the southern fort, the one whose promotion Lucien had blocked 2 years ago, had not been a passive member of Thornmere's coalition. He had been the operational center of it. And he had, 3 days ago, received a shipment through a merchant route that the contact's description made unmistakable. Weapons in sufficient quantity for a garrison to arm a force substantially larger than its own number. The masquerade was not the culmination of Thornmere's plan. It was the distraction. While Lucien stood in his ballroom answering a forged document in front of his assembled court, the actual instrument of the conspiracy would already be in motion 2 days' ride to the south. He sat with the letter in his hands, and the specific cold of a man who has played a long game with skill and patience and has just discovered the board was larger than he was playing on. The political maneuvering, the coalition building, the masquerade gambit, all of it was real, all of it was operational, and all of it was also a frame, a thing designed to hold his attention in the upper floors of his own castle while the structural assault assembled itself below the horizon. He was going to have to be in 2 places at once. He was going to have to answer Thornmere in the ballroom and move military resources to the southern fort simultaneously, without either response knowing about the other, without the court seeing the garrison redeployment and reading it as fear, without Thornmere seeing the countermove and accelerating the southern timeline. And to do it, he was going to have to become, for the next 3 days, a different kind of man than the one he had been for 11 years. Not colder, not harder, but something more complicated than either, something that could stand in a ballroom and protect a woman's father's name and mean it completely while simultaneously coordinating a military response in another theater, and do both things not as performance and not as strategy, but as the simple, irreducible truth of what he had become without intending to. He put the letter down. He picked up his pen. He began to write the orders that would change everything, or end it. The orders took 3 hours to write. Not because the tactical content was complicated. He had planned military responses in worse conditions with less time and less information, but because each order had to accomplish 2 things simultaneously, and neither could reveal the existence of the other. The garrison redeployment to the south was framed as a routine rotation, the kind of administrative movement that happened twice a year and generated no intelligence value for anyone watching the duchy's military calendar. The confirmation letters to his provincial allies were framed as social correspondence related to the masquerade arrangements. The instruction to his legal officer to be present in the ballroom with the documentation, positioned near the east entrance, was framed as a general administrative requirement for any large court gathering. Each individual piece was defensible in isolation. The pattern, if Thornmere's people were reading his correspondence, would not reveal itself until it was too late to matter. He sealed the last letter at the 4th hour. His hand was steady. His chest was the specific kind of tight that happened when the scope of a problem exceeded the body's ability to process it at the pace the situation required, the physical cost of sustained controlled response to sustained pressure. He had learned to work through that tightness years ago. It had a texture he recognized like old weather. He slept for 3 hours. Not well. He was aware, in the shallow layer of sleep that was all he could access, of the piano below the keep, not sounding but present, the way a person is present in a room even when they're not speaking. He woke at first light and dressed in the dark. The next 2 days were the architecture of deception, built room by room with the patient craft of a man who understood that the most effective structural work was invisible until the moment it bore weight. He appeared at every court function with the correct temperature of host's engagement. He spoke to Thornmere twice in social settings with the surface civility they had agreed to, and watched Thornmere perform relaxed confidence with the skill of a man who believed his distraction was working. He reviewed the responses from his southern garrison commanders, the rotation orders acknowledged, the quiet repositioning of the reliable units confirmed, the compromised captain's authority being eroded through administrative procedure in ways that would not become obvious until he had no power left to exercise. On the morning of the masquerade, he went down to the lower chamber. She was there. She had been there since dawn. He could tell from the quality of the lamp oil levels and from the completed fresco section on the upper west wall. 3 figures fully restored, the summer field behind them vivid and specific, the painter's original intention recovered from 6 years of fading. She was standing on the scaffolding looking at her own work with the critical attention of someone measuring the distance between what they had done and what they had intended. She heard him come in. She came down from the scaffolding without hurry. "Tonight," she said, "tonight." She looked at him with the open directness that he had stopped bracing against, had stopped trying to manage his response to, had accepted as simply the condition of her presence the way you accept the condition of a room's temperature. It was what it was, and you adjusted to it, or you left the room, and he was not leaving. "Tell me what it will look like," she said, "from where I'm standing," he told her. The ballroom sequence, the probable timing of Thornmere's move, most likely after the 3rd hour of the masquerade, when the wine and the social momentum had done their work and the room was at peak audience, when a public accusation would land with maximum force and minimum possibility of being managed quietly. Thornmere would use Vane or a proxy to produce the document, physically produce it, make it visible, give it the theater of evidence. The accusation would be framed as a concern for the duchy's integrity, which was the vocabulary that turned personal attack into civic responsibility in these rooms. The court would go quiet. They would look at Lucien. They would look at her. "And you'll cross the room," she said. "Yes." "Before you've publicly answered the accusation." "Yes. The answer comes after the crossing, not before. The crossing is the answer." She was quiet for a moment. "You understand what you're doing." "I understand what I'm doing. If the documentation isn't received as airtight, if even 2 or 3 of the major lords choose to read it as insufficient, I know the risk." She looked at him with something that was past the open directness now, something more interior, something that she was allowing him to see with the specific deliberateness of a person who has decided to stop managing what they show. "Why?" she said, "not strategically. I understand the strategy. Why?" He held her look, the summer fields on the upper wall, the restored piano between them, the keep above them with the court assembling for a night that would end one way or another. "Because your father's name is true," he said. "And Thornmere is going to try to make it untrue in public, and I'm not going to stand on the other side of the room when that happens." She breathed once, slowly. She nodded. She did not perform gratitude or relief. She simply accepted the statement the way she accepted everything, directly, with the full weight of it, without softening the reception. "Then I'll be there," she said. He left the chamber. He climbed the stair for what he did not know was the last peaceful climb he would make for a very long time. The midwinter masquerade filled Ravenshade Keep with light and noise and the specific electricity of a room full of people who knew something was going to happen and didn't know what. The ballroom was the keep's largest space, 2 stories with the upper gallery open to the floor below, and the chandelier arrangement his staff had built for the occasion cast the room in a warm amber that made everyone in it look like a painting of themselves, more vivid, more composed, more permanently arranged than actual flesh. The court in masks was its own theater. He knew every face behind every mask. 11 years of reading this room, he moved through it as the host, which was a role he inhabited without effort, greeting, acknowledging, directing the social current with the practiced ease of a man who understood exactly how much of governance was the management of impression. He spoke to Lord Hargrove Vale and watched the old man's face for the specific set of indicators that would tell him whether Seraphine's defection had reached Thornmere's awareness. It had not. Good. He spoke to the 2 provincial lords he had spent evenings recalibrating and felt the shift in their register toward him. Not alliance, not yet, but the withdrawal of availability from Thornmere's camp, which was the first part of the same thing. He noted Vane's position in the room, near the east entrance with the leather case that he was managing with the careful casualness of a man carrying something he needed to access quickly. He noted Thornmere, circulating with the expansive warmth of a man enjoying his last night of believing he had the advantage. He noted Evelyn Laurent near the south wall, in the dark green dress that was not a court dress but was the best thing she owned and which she wore with the same lack of ceremony she brought to everything else. No mask. She was staff, technically, and had come at his specific instruction rather than court invitation, which meant the social protocols gave her the option of face covering but not the requirement. She had not covered her face. She stood with the specificity of a person who had decided to be exactly where they were and be visible about it. 3 of the court guests had already looked at her and looked away and looked back, and he knew what that pattern meant, and he let it accumulate. At the 2nd hour, the first rider's message arrived. Aldrich brought it to him between conversations, folded and sealed with the southern garrison mark. He read it in the east alcove with his back to the room. The garrison captain had been formally relieved of command 6 hours ago by the senior officer Lucien had positioned for exactly this purpose. The captain had complied without incident, which meant either the coup attempt had a timeline that made the captain disposable at this point, or the captain had not known the full scope of what he was facilitating. The weapons shipment had been quarantined. The militia units Thornmere had been quietly assembling through the merchant route were, without the garrison captain's operational cooperation, a crowd with weapons rather than a force. They could still move. They were no longer coordinated. He folded the message. He returned to the ballroom. 40 minutes later, Thornmere moved. It began not with Vane, but with Lord Cedric himself, which was unexpected. Lucien had assessed that Thornmere would keep distance from the document's physical introduction, would use a proxy to produce it, and then step forward as a concerned third party. Instead, Thornmere walked to the center of the ballroom floor, with the document in his own hand and his mask pushed back from his face and his voice carrying into the room's hush, with the trained projection of a man who had rehearsed this moment and decided that personal delivery was worth the exposure. "Your Grace." Not an address. A summons. The room went exactly the way Lucien had known it would. Sound first, the specific drop in ambient noise that a ballroom achieves when 200 people simultaneously decide to listen. He was on the north side of the room. Evelyn was on the south. Thornmere was between them in the center. "I have in my hand," Thornmere said, with the careful gravity of a man performing civic duty, documentation recovered from the Aldenmere Municipal Archive that was not included in the original investigation record of Henrik Laurent's association with the Carsworth estate misappropriation. The omission was not accidental. The record was withheld through the influence of the Ravenshade estate at the specific request of the late Duchess Marin Ravenshade, who had reason to protect the Laurent family from the full consequences of Henrik Laurent's proven involvement. He looked at Lucien across the room. The Duchy of Valemont deserves to know that its current duke has continued that protection. and that the woman currently residing in this keep and occupying its private chambers, he crossed the room. He did not run. He did not hurry in the way that communicated urgency or alarm. He walked with the full deliberate weight of his title and 11 years of authority through the crowd that parted without being asked. And the crossing itself was the statement, was the answer, was the thing that landed in the room before a word came out of him. 200 people watching the Duke of Ravenshade walk across his own ballroom floor toward a woman standing against the south wall. And the direction of the walk was unmistakable. He reached her. He turned to face the room and he put her at his side. And the positioning was not ceremonial. It was architectural. It was the structure of a man placing himself between a thing and what was coming for it and meaning it past the point of performance. "Master Aldrich," he said. Aldrich was at the east entrance. His legal officer was beside him. The documentation package was already open. What followed was 15 minutes of the most precise public legal demolition he had ever executed. The chief legal officer read the original investigation record with the specific citations that demonstrated the secondary record. Thornmere's document claimed to reveal had no basis in any legitimate archive. Lucien spoke twice. Once to identify the document in Thornmere's hand as a forgery on the basis of 3 specific anachronistic administrative notations that post-dated his mother's death by 2 years, and therefore could not have been suppressed by her, and once to address the court directly on the matter of Henrik Laurent's cleared record and its full legal standing. Both times he spoke without heat, without the performance of injured dignity, with the cold specificity of a man who had prepared for this exact argument and was executing the preparation. The room listened. He watched the provincial lords, the 2 he had recalibrated, and the 3rd who was still Thornmere's, and the wider body of the court. He watched the balance of it, the moment when the room's internal arithmetic shifted from suspension to conclusion. Thornmere tried twice. Both times Lucien answered before the argument could develop momentum, cutting into it with the specific legal citation that removed its structural support. The second time, Thornmere's voice carried something that had not been in it before. Not anger, which would have been manageable, but something raw. A man who had built a thing for 8 months and was watching it fail in public in real time. "The marriage," Lucien said. Into the room's silence. Not because it was the next tactical step, but because it was the truth. And the truth delivered in front of 200 witnesses was the most operationally sound instrument available. He heard her breath beside him change. A single intake, controlled but real, the body's honest response to the unexpected. "I will marry Eveline Laurent," he said to the room, to the ballroom, to the assembled winter court of Valemont, with the voice he used when he was not performing anything at all. The announcement is not a response to Lord Thornmere's accusation. It is a fact that exists independently of whatever Lord Thornmere has or has not produced this evening. The Duchy's administrative office will record it in the morning. The room was the specific silence of 200 people recalibrating simultaneously. Thornmere's face, across the ballroom floor, was the face of a man who had just understood that the gambit he had executed flawlessly had been built on a premise that was no longer true, that the Duke of Ravenshade had nothing he was willing to lose, that the cold empire of his control had no fracture in it, that the weapon Thornmere had spent 8 months sharpening was pointed at something the Duke would step away from. He had not stepped away. The alliance shatter was audible in the movement of the room, not in words, but in the physics of social reconfiguration, people turning toward each other, the provincial lords' faces shifting, the court's arithmetic doing what court arithmetic did when a power demonstration of this magnitude landed cleanly in a public space. The 3rd provincial lord, Thornmere's holdout, looked at the man beside him and then looked at the floor. Thornmere was standing in the center of the room with a forged document in his hand, and his case collapsed and his coalition dissolving around him in real time. He looked at Lucien. The performed warmth was completely gone. What was left was the actual man, cold and calculating and fully aware of what had just happened, and fully aware that what had just happened was not the end of it. "This isn't finished," Thornmere said, quietly, just loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear and remember. "No," Lucien agreed, "it isn't." He meant the Southern militia, the weapons shipment, the network of grievances that didn't dissolve because its figurehead had failed in a ballroom. He meant all of it, and Thornmere heard all of it, and they stood in the amber light of the chandelier with the winter court arranged around them in the specific understanding of two men who had passed the point of social resolution into something that would require a different and more final kind of settlement. Eveline was beside him. She had not moved during the announcement, had not performed shock or gratitude or the complicated public emotion that the moment probably called for, had simply stood with the same level composure she brought to every encounter and let the room move around her. He could feel her breathing beside him, steady, controlled, the breath of a person who had absorbed something large and had not yet decided in full what to do with it. He did not look at her in the ballroom. He could not look at her in the ballroom and maintain the face the room required. He looked at Thornmere. Thornmere looked back. Then Thornmere turned and walked toward the east entrance and out of the ballroom, and Vane followed, and three of the minor lords from the eastern faction followed after a beat's hesitation, and the room watched them go with the specific attention of an audience observing the losing exit. The masquerade continued. It had to. The apparatus of a court event didn't stop because its central drama had resolved. It ran on its own momentum for another 2 hours, while Lucien moved through it with the precise social function of a host whose evening had gone exactly as planned, which was the face he showed and not the thing he was. He spoke to the provincial lords. He accepted the recalibrated postures of half a dozen court members with the neutral acknowledgement they required. He managed the room with 11 years of practiced authority and the specific quality of a man who had just publicly committed himself to something he had been quietly committing to for weeks and was still processing the weight of the commitment. He did not speak to Eveline again that evening. She left the ballroom at the third hour with the quiet efficiency that characterized all her movements, and he watched her go from across the room and did not follow. At the fourth hour, Aldrich found him. The face was the face again. The particular set of it that Lucien had learned to read as the category of news that required that face. "The East Wing," Aldrich said low and close. "There's smoke." The keep was already burning before the alarm reached the upper floors. Not the ballroom, not the main structure. The East Wing, the residential section, the guest chambers, and the corridors connecting them to the main keep. And the smoke was not the smoke of accident. It was moving with the specific directional intention of something set rather than sparked. And by the time Lucien reached the east corridor, the air had the quality that meant the source was close and the structure was already involved. His garrison captain, his real garrison captain, not the compromised man in the south, was already in the corridor with 4 men. "East servant's stair is blocked," the captain said. "Fires in the wall cavity, spreading toward the main junction. Someone set it at multiple points. Where are the guests?" "Evacuating through the north exit. Most are out." "Most?" A beat. "We're missing 3 household staff, 2 guests, and—" The captain stopped. Lucien looked at him. "Miss Laurent," the captain said. "She was last seen going toward the lower stair." The lower stair, the east lower access, the underground chamber. He was moving before the captain finished the sentence into the smoke-thickened corridor, toward the east stair, and what was in him as he moved was not the cold precision he had operated from for 11 years, that had burned off cleanly in the first breath of smoke air. What was in him was something older and less managed, the animal urgency of a man who had finally, after long careful denial, admitted what mattered, and was now running toward it through a burning building. He hit the east stair and went down. The smoke was heavier below. The fire was in the east wing above, but the building's ventilation drew the smoke downward through the stair shaft, and by the second landing his eyes were streaming and the air required conscious management, short breaths, low to the wall, where the oxygen sat. He had been in burning buildings before. He had learned what he was learning now in actual war, on actual ground, which was that the body under genuine threat moves with a clarity that no amount of training entirely replicates, a stripping away of everything non-essential until what remains is the single operative fact. The single operative fact was the door at the bottom of the stair. He hit the lower corridor and pushed through it, and the chamber door was closed. Not locked. The handle moved under his hand, and he pushed it open, and the smoke came with him from the corridor, and the chamber was full of it, lower density near the floor where the lamps were still burning and impossible near the ceiling. She was not at the piano. She was at the far wall, the research table, and she had something in her hands, not the portfolio, something from underneath the table, a wrapped document case that she had apparently been looking for before the smoke made the room untenable. She turned when the door opened, and her face had the specific appearance of a person who had been in smoke long enough for the eyes to show it, streaming and red-rimmed, and her composure was intact in the way that composure is intact when the alternatives are not viable. "There's a secondary route," she said. Her voice was rough. "The original construction. The Lord who built down before he built up. There's an eastern access, original excavation. It's in the construction records. I found it in the second volume, The Night in the Library." She held up the document case. "And this was here, under the research table, not mine. Thornmere's people left it." He crossed the chamber to her. He took the document case. He took her arm. "Show me the eastern access," he said. She moved. She had mapped the room in the weeks of working in it, and she moved through the smoke with the assurance of someone who knew where the walls were without seeing them. And he kept her arm and followed her to the northeast corner, behind the scaffolding, where a section of the stone wall had a different texture from the surrounding construction. Older, the original excavation facing, and in it, when she put her hands on the correct stone and pushed, a low door that had not been opened in a very long time. Cold air came through it. Outside air from the original drainage channel that ran under the east courtyard, out to the keep's outer perimeter. He looked back at the chamber once. The piano, the oil lamps, the restored frescoes on the upper walls, the summer fields, the figures in their permanent motion. The painter's original intention recovered from years of fading. He went through the door behind her into the cold and the dark. They emerged in the outer courtyard behind the east wall, in the cold night air with the smoke behind them and the winter sky overhead, and she leaned against the outer wall and breathed, genuinely breathed, the body's urgent response to clean air after deprivation. And he stood beside her and did the same, and the document case was in his hand and the keep was burning behind them, and somewhere above in the keep, Thornmere's plan had evolved past the ballroom into something with fire in it, which meant it had also evolved past anything that a civil response architecture could answer. He looked at her face in the cold night, the composure reassembling itself over the evidence of the smoke and what the smoke had required of her. He looked at the document case. Whatever was in it, whatever Thornmere's people had planted in the lower chamber, was in his hand now, unread. And above them, in the burning east wing, Lord Cedric Thornmere was still in the building, which meant the men Thornmere had placed in the building were still in the building, and the garrison captain was somewhere in the smoke managing an evacuation with 4 men. And the thing that had been a political conspiracy 6 hours ago had become something with weapons and fire. She looked at the document case in his hands, and then at his face, and she said, with the roughness of smoke still in her voice, "Open it." He opened it. What was inside was not a weapon, and not a forgery. What was inside was a set of documents that had his mother's seal on them. The actual seal, the wax impression he would know under any conditions, and handwriting he recognized, and a set of names that stopped his breath mid-inhale and restarted it differently. The conspiracy was older than Thornmere, and one of the names on his mother's sealed correspondence, dated 6 years ago, written in her hand 3 months before she died, was a name that lived in Ravenshade Keep at this moment, had lived here for 11 years, had managed the domestic operations of his castle for every year of his rule. He looked up from the documents. Somewhere above them, through the stone and smoke, a single voice was shouting orders in the burning east wing. Petra's voice. He stood in the cold outer courtyard with his mother's handwriting in his hands, and the keep burning above him, and 11 years of architecture collapsing in the space between one breath and the next. Petra. He ran the name through every year he had known her, and the name held, didn't crack, didn't produce the retroactive revelation that made betrayal legible in hindsight. That was the particular cruelty of it. There was no moment he could point to where he should have known, no pattern he had missed through carelessness or sentiment. She had been exactly what she appeared to be for 11 years. The loyalty had been real, or real enough, until whatever Thornmere had offered her exceeded the weight of 11 years of real service, or until what his mother had started 6 years ago in those sealed letters had finally found its operational moment. He didn't have time to determine which. He folded the documents back into the case. "Stay here," he said to Eveline. "No," she said. He looked at her. Her eyes were still streaming from the smoke. Her voice was still rough, and she was looking at him with the specific quality of her looking that communicated she had already considered the instruction and rejected it on grounds that were not emotional but structural. She was not staying in the outer courtyard alone while Thornmere's people were still in the building. He didn't argue. He moved toward the East Wing's outer service entrance, and she followed. The East Wing's lower level was navigable. The fire was in the wall cavities of the upper floor, not yet through to the structural timber, and the smoke had stratified in the way smoke stratified in stone buildings, thick near the ceiling and thinner near the floor. He moved low and fast through the service corridor with Eveline behind him and the document case under his arm, and the sounds of the building told him what he needed. The garrison captain's voice from somewhere above on the main stair, the sound of boots on stone in the north corridor that was not his garrison's pattern. Thornmere's men were still inside. He understood the revised plan in the space of 3 steps. The fire was the cover for a secondary extraction. Not Thornmere himself. Thornmere would not be here for the physical part of it, but the men he had placed in the household, the 2 that Lucien had reassigned and who had apparently reassigned themselves back during the masquerade's distraction, and whatever they had been sent to retrieve or destroy before the fire made the wing uninhabitable. The documents in his hand, his mother's correspondence, the actual origin record of the conspiracy, which predated Thornmere by 6 years and which, in the wrong hands, told a story about Ravenshade Keep's internal fracture that could damage the duchy's stability far past anything a ballroom accusation could accomplish. He reached the main east corridor junction and stopped. Petra was standing at the far end of it. She was not alone. 2 men flanked her, not in livery, and she had in her hands a document case that was the twin of the one he was carrying, a second copy, or the original, or something else entirely that he would have to determine later. She saw him at the same moment he saw her, and her face did something complicated and rapid, a sequence of expressions that moved through recognition and assessment, and something underneath both that he did not have the capacity to name in the current circumstances. "Your Grace," she said. 14 years of the same 2 words, calibrated to the same precise register of formal address. It landed differently now. Petra. His voice was level. The interior was not level. He had learned to manage the gap a long time ago, and the management held even now, even in a smoke-filled corridor with her standing at the end of it with his mother's documents in her hands and the building burning around them. "Put the case down." She looked at him for a moment. Behind her, one of the 2 men shifted his weight, and Lucien tracked the movement with the peripheral attention of someone who has been in physical danger enough times to map a room's threat geometry without appearing to. "I served your mother for 20 years before I served you," Petra said. "I want you to know that before anything else happens." "I know that. What's in that case," she looked at what he was carrying, "is not what Thornmere told you it is. He told you it was correspondence between your mother and a co-conspirator. That's the frame he built around it." She paused. The smoke moved through the corridor between them. "Your mother knew the conspiracy was coming. She knew because she was the one who identified it. She spent the last year of her life documenting the network that Thornmere's predecessor built inside this duchy, and she sealed the correspondence and left it in the lower chamber because she didn't trust the upper keep with it. She didn't trust me with it. She was right not to trust me with it." The corridor was quiet except for the building's sound. The deep structural language of stone conducting heat, the distant percussion of the garrison working the evacuation above. "She knew," Lucien said. "She knew. She couldn't act on it. She was dying and she couldn't act on it. And she left the documentation where she left it, and Petra stopped. Something in her face did the thing that faces do when the architecture of justification finally fails, and what's underneath is simply the fact of what you did. Thornmere's predecessor found me 4 years after she died. He had a letter. One letter, in her handwriting, that she had written to a contact and that had been intercepted. The letter named me as a trusted source. It wasn't true. She had used my name without my knowledge as a cover identity for one of her actual contacts. But the letter existed, and it was her handwriting, and I could not prove it was a cover. "They owned you," Lucien said, "for 2 years. Then Thornmere took over the network and the ownership transferred." She held the document case in her hands with the specific quality of someone holding something they no longer want but don't know how to set down. "Everything I gave them was administrative, nothing that cost lives. I told myself—" She stopped again. She knew what she had told herself, and she knew, standing here, what that was worth. "I told myself it was containment, that as long as I was inside the operation, I could limit the damage. How long has Thornmere known about the documents in the lower chamber? Since autumn, when the Restoration Commission was awarded. He knew your mother had left documentation. The network had known for years there was something in the lower levels. They didn't know the specific location until the commission created access. Her eyes moved briefly to Evelyn behind him. The musician wasn't his target. She was his access point. The corridor, the smoke, the two men behind Petra who had not moved since he arrived and who were waiting for an instruction that had not come, which meant Petra had not decided yet what instruction she was going to give. "Set the case down," Lucien said, "and call your men off." A long moment, long enough that the building made its sounds around them, and the smoke shifted, and the gap between what had been true for 14 years and what was true now opened fully into the space between them. She set the case on the floor. She looked at him with the face of a woman who had run out of the architecture of self-justification and was standing in what was left. And what was left was not comfortable, but it was real, and real was what she had left to offer. "The case has her full documentation," Petra said. "Every name, every network node, every transaction record from the original conspiracy to Thornmere's current operation. She was thorough. She was always thorough." A pause. "She was a better intelligence officer than anyone who ever worked for you, including me." He walked to the case. He picked it up. He held both cases under one arm, and he looked at Petra for a long moment with the specific quality of looking that he gave things he needed to fully assess before he could decide what they were. "Where is Thornmere?" he said. "North exit." He was moving for the horses when the fire was set. He had a timed withdrawal. If the ballroom move failed, the fire was the contingency. He intended to be gone before anyone understood the full scope. "He's not gone." It was Evelyn who said it. She had moved up beside him in the corridor, and she was looking past him toward the north junction, and when he turned, he saw what she had seen. The garrison captain coming from the north with two of his men, and between them, with the specific physical quality of a man who had been stopped mid-motion, Lord Cedric Thornmere. Thornmere's face when he saw Lucien holding both document cases was the face of a man watching the last exit close. He did not perform. Whatever social mask he had worn for the entirety of the winter court stripped away in that corridor, in the smoke, in the evidence of the cases under Lucien's arm. And what was left was the actual man. Not cold, not calculating, but something more human and therefore more comprehensible. A man who had built a large and patient thing and had watched it fail and was standing in the ruin of it with nowhere left to construct a version of events that served him. "It was never about you," Thornmere said. His voice had lost its projection, its calibrated carrying quality. He was speaking to the corridor, to the smoke, to something he was working through in real time. "The original network. Your mother was right about it. She was always right about it. But the network wasn't built to destroy Ravenshade. It was built because the duchy's consolidation broke 3 generations of land arrangement that those families had maintained for 100 years. The grievance was real." "The grievance may have been real," Lucien said. "The methods weren't. A real grievance comes to the council table. It petitions. It argues its case in the legal architecture that exists specifically for real grievances." He looked at Thornmere with the evenness of a man who had processed his anger somewhere between the east corridor and this junction and was now on the other side of it, in the territory where anger becomes something more durable. "You didn't want resolution, you wanted reversal. Those are different things and they require different architectures, and the architecture you chose ends here." Thornmere looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Something in his face shifted. Not apology. Something adjacent to apology. The recognition of a specific collateral damage that had not been the point and had happened anyway. He said nothing. The garrison captain took him through the north exit. Lucien stood in the corridor with both document cases and the smoke thinning around them as the upper floor fire met the stone of the main keep's exterior wall and found nothing left to consume in the east wing's interior. He stood there for longer than was strictly necessary. Evelyn stood beside him. Neither of them spoke immediately, which was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had come through something large and were giving it the space it required before they tried to put words to it. Petra had not moved. She was standing at the far end of the corridor with her hands at her sides, and the specific stillness of a woman waiting for a verdict she had already issued to herself. He looked at her. "Go to Aldrich," he said. "Tell him I want a full written account by morning. Everything, from the first contact to tonight. Every name, every instruction, every piece of information that passed. All of it." He paused. "Then stay in the keep." She looked at him with the question in it. "You're not free," he said. "And what you did is not resolved by a corridor conversation in a burning building. But my mother trusted you for 20 years for reasons that predated their leverage, and those reasons are part of the record too." He held her eyes. "The full account by morning." She nodded once. She walked away. He watched her go and felt the specific weight of what it cost to hold two true things simultaneously: the betrayal and the 20 years before it, the damage and the original fidelity underneath the damage, and not collapse either one into the other for the sake of simplicity. It would have been simpler to choose one truth and discard the other. Simpler things were not always structurally sound. He turned to Evelyn. She was looking at him with the open, direct quality of her looking, and there was something in it now that had not been there in their first weeks. Not more warmth. She had always been warm in the specific way of someone who had no reason to withhold warmth. But something layered under the warmth. Something that had been built by the particular accumulation of what they had been through together in this keep, and was now visible in the way things become visible when the emergency passes and the light settles. "Your father's documentation," he said. "Both the original clearance record and the secondary case, the forged document and the evidence of its forgery, will go to the Aldenmere archive and to the duchy's permanent legal record. His name will be correct in every record that exists in this duchy before spring." She breathed, once, slow. The thing she had been carrying, the 3 years of her father with the clearance papers in a box under his bed, the professional death that preceded his actual death, the weight of a name made wrong by proximity to other people's corruption. She breathed it out in that single slow exhalation, and he watched it leave her. Not completely, not without remainder, but enough. "Thank you," she said. "It's accurate," he said. "Accuracy isn't gratitude territory." Something moved in her face that was almost a smile, and almost something larger than a smile, and she did not perform either option. She simply looked at him with the full weight of it and let him see it. They walked out of the east wing together into the outer courtyard, and then through the service gate into the main keep's north entrance, and the winter night was cold and specific around them, the smoke from the east wing rising against the dark sky in a column that the wind was already beginning to disperse. The season after the rebellion was spring. That was not a coincidence of calendar. The legal proceedings against Thornmere and his coalition moved through the duchy's judicial apparatus with the documentation his mother had spent her last year compiling, and the comprehensiveness of her record was such that the proceedings were not prolonged. Every name in her documentation was brought to account. The garrison captain in the south was tried and removed. The merchant houses that had funded the weapons shipment were stripped of their duchy trade licenses. Thornmere himself was stripped of his title and lands and sent to the eastern border territories with enough resources to survive and insufficient resources to rebuild. A sentence that was not mercy and was not cruelty, but was the specific calibration of a man who had decided that permanent exile from consequence was not justice, and permanent destruction was not wisdom. The east wing was rebuilt over the winter. Stonework, new timber, the wall cavities repaired, and the fire damage erased in the methodical way that physical damage could be erased, differently from the other kind, which left marks that were not necessarily the wrong kind of marks. Lucien learned this slowly. He learned it in the way he learned most things that mattered, which was through the accumulation of specific instances rather than through a single moment of revelation, because he had always been suspicious of single moments of revelation as structurally insufficient to the weight they were asked to bear. He learned it the morning he sat in his study and found himself looking at the wall where the duchy map was pinned and noticing that he was not scanning it for threat vectors. He was looking at the Eastern Valley holdings and thinking about the harvest rotation proposal that the provincial council had submitted, and the quality of his attention was the attention of someone managing something he had a stake in rather than defending something he could not afford to lose. The distinction was not dramatic. It was not a revelation. It was just different, the way a room is different when the temperature changes. You notice it not in one breath, but over several. He learned it in the conversations he had with Petra, which were not comfortable and were not designed to be comfortable. She gave him the full written account as requested, and it was comprehensive, and reading it required him to sit with the specific texture of a betrayal that was not simple. Not the clean villain architecture that made betrayals manageable, but the complicated human structure of a person who had been genuinely loyal and had been leveraged and had made choices that were wrong and had continued making them because the alternative required a courage she had found too late. He sat with that and did not simplify it. He kept her in the household in a reduced administrative capacity, with full awareness of the risk that involved, and with the specific reasoning that the risk was known and therefore managed, and that whatever function she served going forward would be under a different quality of observation than the previous 14 years. He did not forgive her in the clean transactional sense, because what she had done did not have a clean transactional resolution. He simply continued with the full account of what she was now part of his working knowledge. He learned it most clearly on the afternoon he walked down the east stair, the stair that had been rebuilt in the renovation, the stone the same, but the weight of it different now, worn differently. His own footfall on it less like a man approaching something he was trying to avoid, and more like a man going where he intended to go, and found the lower chamber transformed. Eveline had done it over the late winter months, working with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, and the transformation was not dramatic in the visual sense, but was absolute in the experiential sense. The frescoes were fully restored, the summer fields vivid and specific and exactly what they had always been before the years had faded them. The figures in their motion fully legible now, and there was something about the restoration that was not mere recovery, but was a kind of resurrection. The original intention made present again in a room where it had been absent for 6 years. The acoustic panels she had specified were installed along the north and south walls, materials that clarified the chamber's sound without changing its character. The piano stood at the center with the lid up and the keys in the light, and the instrument's restored voice available to anyone who sat down at it. It was not a private room anymore. That was the transformation. She had kept the intimacy of its proportions, the original Lord's design that she had identified on the first night as built for private experience rather than public function, and had made of it something that was intimate and shared simultaneously. Not a contradiction, but an integration, the way certain things are only fully themselves when they are given away. 6 musicians from the Aldenmere Conservatory's orphan training program arrived in early spring. They were between 12 and 16, and they moved through the keep with the careful attention of people who understood that the space around them had weight and were not sure yet how to carry themselves in it. Eveline met them in the main hall with the efficiency and warmth that she brought to everything in equal proportion, and he watched from the upper gallery without being seen, and what he watched was a woman who was doing the thing she had always been building toward. Not the restoration of a single instrument, not the recovery of a single room, but the making of a place where the thing she loved had a permanent home and a future past her own tenure in it. Das kann coaxed him down from the gallery. She saw him at the stair. The 6 young musicians were being shown to their rooms by Aldrich, who had adapted to the expanded household operations with the unflappable competence of a man who had managed stranger things and would manage stranger still. She crossed the hall to him, and the look she gave him was the full open version of her looking, and there was something in it that was the accumulated weight of everything. The night in the burning corridor, the ballroom, the piano phrase that had come up through the stone on the first night and fractured something in him that never closed over again, all of it present in the look and none of it performed. "You're watching," she said. "I'm watching. You could have come down." "I was going to come down." He looked at the corridor where Aldrich had taken the musicians. "Are they what you hoped?" "They're terrified," she said. "The good ones are always terrified when they first arrive somewhere that matters. It means they understand what's at stake." A pause. "I was terrified when I arrived here." He looked at her. "Not of you," she said, "of what the room meant, the piano. Someone had loved it before me and then stopped being able to love it. And that's a different kind of restoration than a mechanical one." She met his eyes with the full weight of what she was saying, which she always did with the full weight, never the partial version. You can restore the mechanism and still not bring back what it was built for. He understood what she was telling him about the piano and about something else entirely. The two things not separate in her assessment, but the same assessment made at 2 registers simultaneously, and he held it without deflection, without the managed response, without the 11 years of practice distance from anyone having access to the actual interior architecture of him. "It's back," he said. He meant the music in the keep. He also meant something he had not had language for before this year. The version of himself that had existed before he buried it in discipline and control, and the long, efficient silence of a man who had decided survival required the elimination of what could be taken. That version had not been resurrected intact. It had come back differently, with the marks of what had been survived and the knowledge of what it had cost to survive it, and the marks were not damage. They were the record of a real life having been lived. He was 34 years old, and he had survived a conspiracy, a fire, and the specific deeper undoing of being seen clearly by a person who did not manage what they saw. He was standing in his own hall in the spring light, with the sound of young musicians moving through the upper corridors and the woman he had married in this hall during the worst night of both their lives beside him. And the thing that the hall contained now was not the cold, careful architecture of a man who needed nothing he could lose. It was the warmer and more dangerous architecture of a man who had chosen. He had learned, across the winter and into the spring, that the version of power he had built, the iron precision, the emotional quarantine, the sustained performance of needing nothing, had never actually been strength. It had been the structure a person builds when they have confused invulnerability with survival. When the real thing that was lost was not safety, but the capacity to risk anything. Real strength, the kind that held under genuine weight rather than the manageable weight of political threat and military maneuvering, was not the absence of fracture. It was what you built after the fracture opened, with the full knowledge of what opening cost, and the decision to build it anyway. Ravenshade Keep still made men find reasons to leave rooms. The Duke of Ravenshade still moved through his duchy with a quality of authority that had no softness in it and required none. The kingdom still feared him, in the specific way that kingdoms fear a man who has proven that neither fire nor conspiracy nor the long patience of assembled grievances can move him from what he has decided to protect. But in the candlelit corridors of the lower chamber, music moved through the stone every evening now, and the young musicians who came to the conservatory told each other in whispers that the Duke had been known to stop in the east corridor sometimes, and stand there with his hand against the wall and his eyes open, and that he stayed there until the phrase below resolved itself, and then he walked on. None of them understood what that cost him to stop. None of them understood what it cost him not to. Only one person in Ravenshade Keep understood both things, and she was playing.